Hello and good evening to all attendees tonight for a special evening with Tara Houska, Indigenous lawyer and Earth protector, and the folks of the WGSI here at the University of Toronto, St. George campus. My name is Wafat Hassan, and I come here today to you as a refugee settler on Turtle Island. The theme for International Women's Day this year is Break the Bias. And I invite attendees and panelists here today to think about the ways in which we can break biases by employing a theory of trans politics that deconstructs colonial binary structures that shape our world in various ways through various modes of binarizing the world. I'd like us to think about these colonial binaries and the way that they have had the effect of not only producing harmful sex and gender binary constructs, but also binaries of civility and barbarism, of productivity and non-productivity, citizen workers and alien subjects. In Tara Houska's work, particularly recently on the Enbridge tar sands pipeline in Minnesota, we can see the way in which bodies are organized along categories of insiders and outsiders, along lines which are mostly related to capital gain and the naturalized projects of extraction of the earth and its resources. Tara Houska, who will be introduced more formally shortly by one of our esteemed students in the WGSI, implodes these binary structures on various fronts, including the legal front, political, cultural, and the activist front. What I loved most when I heard Tara Houska speak for the first time is the fierce resolve in her fearlessness and the secondhand ways in which she embodies the decolonial imperative through her discourse, pacing, and disposition, allowing us sometimes to sit in the somberness of and contemplation of the information that we are discussing, and with the simultaneous confident resolve, which I believe counters the ways in which we, as a community and society, are structurally gaslit en masse. It is a healing and validating experience of truth-telling when I hear Tara speak, and it is an absolute pleasure to have you with us here today, Tara. Thank you for spending this time with us. I will now introduce two of our wonderful undergraduate students here at the WGSI, leaders who will be sharing a land acknowledgement as well as Tara's formal bio before Tara begins her talk. And after Tara's talk, we will open up the Q&A. Questions can be coming in throughout the talk, and we will be able to see them. And then we will sort of take them up after Tara's talk. And our apologies in advance if we are not able to get to all of them tonight. So Mackenzie Stevenson is the president of the Women and Gender Studies Union in her fourth year, double majoring in Women and Gender Studies and Sociology with a minor in Caribbean Studies. And Serene Shada is the first year representative for the Women and Gender Studies Student Union. She works as a liaison between the undergrad students and the executive committee of the student union, and she supports initiatives to build community. So take it away, Serene.
Thank you, Ava. So I'll be delivering the land acknowledgement today, and I want to start by addressing the fact that we enter this space with different levels of education about Indigenous peoples and their histories. I want to address that land acknowledgements are an Indigenous tradition, and we use them here to respect Indigenous relationships to the land. Reflecting on the land reminds us of broader perspectives that expand our understanding to encompass the rich history of our land, especially in terms of centering our conversations today to be able to reflect on our identities, actions of reconciliation, and the privileges of settlers, including myself, that reside here. We're all on different land in this virtual space, so I'll be delivering a revised land acknowledgement that was created in part by collaboration between the elders at First Nations House and University of Toronto faculty and staff, as we are primarily connected for the University of Toronto St. George campus that has coordinated this event. I will now read the revised land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this is the home of many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. As I reflect on my relationship to this land, I ask that you take a moment to reflect on how you've come into the land today. I entered this stolen land as an immigrant and uninvited settler who's able to live here because of the stewardship of Indigenous peoples who have cared for it for centuries. My roots are embedded in Lebanon and Palestine, so I reflect on the effects of colonialism and genocide and the devastating impact of this, which has made Indigenous peoples particularly vulnerable to climate change for the continued destruction, alterations, and contamination of the environment. I also invite you to think about what agreements have been made on this land that you may be implicated in. For immigration, I've benefited from the settler colonialism that has taken place. I acknowledge that I've never worried about having access to clean and safe drinking water, or whether I would be forced to migrate due to my land becoming uninhabitable, a privilege that many Indigenous peoples in Canada do not have. I encourage you to reflect on how you're practicing reconciliation in action. Some things I do in my day-to-day is continuously working on becoming more educated on these topics through seeking information and self-reflection, valuing opportunities to learn, and recognizing that there is emotional labor that comes with the work that Tara and so many other incredible Indigenous people have been doing. I'm also mindful of my environmental footprint, taking care to recycle, trying to conserve water, and being purposeful when I make purchases about the companies, systems, and individuals that I support and enable when I'm doing so. I ask that you please take a moment to acknowledge the land and the nations who came before you from where you currently reside. We'll be sharing some links in the chat that you can use to learn more about the land that you're on, and I encourage you to keep making reflections throughout the duration of the event today.
Thank you, Serene. My name is Mackenzie. I want to introduce Tara. Tara Houska is from the Couchiching First Nation. She's a tribal attorney, founder of the Giniw Collective, and a former advisor on Native American affairs to Bernie Sanders. She spent 6 months on the front lines fighting the Dakota Access Pipeline and is currently engaged in the movement to defund fossil fuels and a year-long struggle against Enbridge Line 3 pipeline. She's a co-founder of Not Your Mascots, a group committed to positive representation of Native peoples. She's a TED speaker, the 2017 Harvard Public Interest Keynote, received an Awesome Women Award from Melinda Gates, the 2021 American Climate Leadership Award, as well as a 2019 Rachel's Network Catalyst Award, and is featured in Women: A Century of Change by National Geographic. Tara has written for the women-led collective, women-led climate anthology, All We Can Save, and the New York Times, CNN, The Guardian, Vogue, and Indian Country Today. So please welcome me in welcoming Tara Houska.
Hey, Bijou. Thanks for that. Appreciate it. Thanks for the kind words, Wafa, and for the introduction. Jabawekwe Indigenous Makwa and Dudame, Couchiching and Dunchiba. My name is Tara. I'm Bear Clan from Couchiching First Nation. I'm calling in on Zoom today from Couchiching First Nation, or I guess right next to it, actually. This part of the territory was taken. I appreciate the land acknowledgement for sure. And I know there's a lot of thought that goes into those efforts to at least acknowledge. And I think the pieces that I'm most involved in the work I do is well, what happens next? What are the actions? What are the behaviors and substance of the words that we say? You know, how do we carry that forward? And that's reflected, I think, too, in not only acknowledging the land and the history of that land, but acknowledging the personhood and the life of that land, wherever it may be, that we are in community and we are guests also. You know, I mean, we're all here so temporarily. And if anything that I've learned from nature over the years of working so closely with advocacy around nature is seeing the beauty of action reflected in that. the language of lies is not really present in nature, right? I mean, I guess there's animals that disguise themselves and things like that to survive, but the roles and the purpose and the intentions are ones that are based in honesty and integrity and purpose. Yeah, so I asked right before this started where everyone was at, or at least like the bulk of folks. And it sounds like most of you are, or at least a large portion of folks are first years, second years. Super exciting time. I can't imagine what that's like going through COVID and Zoom. That's got to be pretty wild. And also just thinking about, for y'all that are in that place in your life right now, that so much has happened in that time, and it's just continued on, and it's almost like this snowball that just keeps getting bigger and bigger. Like, you got so many world events, like huge moments where you don't think that you're ever going to see something like that. Like, okay, we watched the US Capitol get overrun by a bunch of white supremacists and folks calling themselves patriots. And I mean, we saw that, like we all watched it on television, right? I mean, it was nuts. And yet now here we are watching the media trying to spin that into something that it definitely wasn't, right? Which is peaceful protest or whatever. Seeing the calls of Black and brown folks from the ground finally reaching a boiling point with the murder of George Floyd, which happened a few hours south of where I'm at. I'm calling in from Minnesota, from northern Minnesota, and seeing that. And then these other world struggles that are just ongoing, like, this continued shared intergenerational, at this point, resistance to liberate Palestine and to reach a point of at least basic equity, and human rights being observed, and that being present too in so many other places around the globe, and that's not just Ukraine, right? That's so many places. But yeah, so now there's another, we had this huge pandemic where I think, at least for those of us that are doing this work involving nature, to me, the pandemic it was kind of like if all the other wake-up calls around rising seas and disappearing homelands and the loss of traditional ways of being wasn't enough, because it clearly wasn't. I mean, those are Black and brown folks around the world, right, that are largely experiencing climate crisis. And so it just wasn't permeating into the so-called Western civilized society. I don't really know how civilized it is when you're engaging in human rights abuses around the globe and your way of life comes at the cost of so much pain and suffering of others, not just humans either. But if all that wasn't being heard, here's the pandemic to remind us that Mother Nature can indeed shut down this society and the framework that human beings have created. And so that happened, right? And still happening. I mean, I actually personally just got over COVID a couple weeks ago, and it was still very, very tired from that. But I was fortunate to be all right, and so many others have not been. And then right away we start 2022, and it's like, okay, maybe the masks are coming off, yeah, I guess we're not really going to pay attention so much, or we're going to silence or look away from what this means for immunocompromised folks, for folks that are more at risk. But it seemed like, people were wanting to get back to this quote unquote normal. And then along comes this potentially World War III and all of that happening. And then on top of it, climate crisis just accelerating so quickly. Seeing the ocean on fire this last summer, and I remember that on Twitter, and we were out, chaining ourselves to machines, trying to stop this tar sands pipeline from going through the Mississippi River headwaters, from going through our wild rice beds, from going through the drinking water of millions of people. And there's this video clip of the ocean on fire because of a spill and a leak under the surface of the water. Moments like that, and like grappling with humanity at 18, 19 years old, I can't quite wrap my mind around it. I can't quite wrap my mind around it at 37, right? Like, still trying to figure out, how do we be effective? How do we be the best versions of ourselves that we can with so much pressure and so much inequity around us? How do we find our way through this social media and kind of like these fabrications of parts of ourselves to distract ourselves and to also see so much trauma happening and somehow still keep scrolling, right? And to keep going and to keep it focused and to keep ourselves moving forward. Where do we find purpose in all that? I think, I can't answer that question for everyone. I know that for myself, it's been a journey for sure to get to this place that I'm at now. It was a lot of schooling, and then it was a foray into federal politics, or at least the federal political sphere. I was kind of, I was a lawyer working for lots of tribes and working for the White House at one point, working for Bernie Sanders at another, and then this return to the land, of where I'm from and of what the truth for me really is, which is the truth is present in the forest. The truth is present in the water, in these undeniable truths of who we are as living beings, where we fit in the web of life. It was in taking all that I had learned in all these different places, a lot of them colonial spheres, and figuring out how do I contribute those skills to the greater whole? How do I try to protect the earth that is under assault? And it was foraying out into the world to really see what was going on. I think for some of us, climate change is creeping around the edges, but if you're in a rural, remote place like I came from, it's not something that you're really that involved in. You're seeing it happen to the place. And then when you go out into the world and you start to see the disconnection that people have, that so much of the societal fabric has and teaches and embeds in people, that even those advocates who are pushing so hard for the environment do so in ways that are familiar to them, but also, in my assessment, very disconnected. It's a language of statistics. It's a language of economic growth. It's the language of resources, looking at a living being that we depend on as a resource and not a relative. That can be really disconcerting for sure. And so I think it's been a journey of trying to walk a line of maintaining integrity and maintaining what I know to be true, and learning, obviously, the depth of those truths, but then learning skills around it and learning ways to guide the work and to make it more effective. I know this is a event about women, or International Women's Day. I really appreciate the message at the beginning about inclusivity and about thinking of the harms of the gender binary, which is, that's something too. Like, you look at that, and nature there's so many variations, right, that exist. And it's not black and white. It's not just masculine and feminine. It's not as simplistic. Instead, there's a lot of nuances and an ecosystem, right? An ecosystem that has so many different roles and so many different functions. And each one is intrinsically tied to the next, right? Each one is in this relationship. And a lot of it is mutuality based, right? And a lot of it is not so rigid. It's actually very fluid. Animals that change gender, plants that change gender. I mean, what's the concept of gender to someone that doesn't define it that way, that doesn't have a definition like that? I mean, our own people, my people, we have many, many, many different terms for different roles and different ways to identify oneself. It's not necessarily about gender, actually. It's something quite different. It's just a role that you offer to the greater whole. I would also say, though, I think that what I've seen happening in this time has been some balancing out of pieces of imbalance, which for myself, that's a lot of the work that I really care about, is trying to balance out our relationships with each other, balancing out our relationships with nature, trying to find balance in our own lives, rather than trying to continue to solve issues with solutions that mirror the problem. I mean, I've said this many times, I do not believe we're going to solar panel or wind turbine our way out of climate crisis. We're not going to nuclear our way out of this issue that's been created, which is not only extraction and extractive economy, it's consumption, and it's belief that we are above the basic truths of nature, that we are somehow not part of the web, that we're above the web, controlling it, and that it exists for us. And so this rise in women's leadership in certain spaces, I think in frontline spaces, it's been pretty apparent that a lot of women are leading. Women, femmes, and non-binary folks stepping into these spaces. To me, that has to do with balancing out of a lot of the patriarchal underpinnings that have contributed to where we're at. This dominant narrative of the earth exists for us to dominate, that knowledge exists for us to dominate. I mean, even the way of learning, when you think about how you learn in a so-called colonial type setting versus how you learn in a lodge. Very different ways of thinking about information and what it means. You know, you get a degree in one and you have now dominated and mastered that subject or whatever, or you've met the qualifications to be an expert on it versus, or at least alongside, a completely different way of knowing, which is we are lifelong students. You know, I'm a lifelong student still trying to learn even the most basic pieces of protocols. Having learned enough to teach others some, but still recognizing that I'm a student myself and will be my entire life. Yeah, I think it's got to be a very complicated time, no matter what time of life that we're in, for so many of us to grapple with and to struggle with these fluctuating emotions that I know I certainly feel, which is, you know, sometimes you're just so overwhelmed by it all, or so enraged by it all, so saddened by it all, so numb to it all. How do you find ways to keep moving forward? You know, I think it's oftentimes framed around hope. And I think there's a piece to be said about hope, for sure. Like there's, you know, the hope of us as humans figuring it out a little better than we have, that we find empathy for one another, that we find purpose and stop destroying ourselves and harming so much to in that quest of self-destruction, that we stop dangling objects that we create as the measures of being successful, that we begin to value kindness and the ability to see the hands behind the things that we get, things that we want. But I don't really think about centering my own work so much around hope. I think it's more around a couple different pieces, which are that piece I've been talking about, I think is around purpose. You know, finding that purpose, whatever it may be, whether that's going out and chaining yourself to a machine sometimes, or being a thinker or a writer or an artist or a musician or a healer or so many other ways of being and ways of using our energy and our time here. Purpose is so counteractive to that that gnawing kind of like depression I think that so many people are feeling. I've especially seen that with folks who are grappling with climate depression, you know, and thinking about where we're at as a species and trying to find hope in that is can be sometimes really hard. I mean, I think it's always present. There's always, you always got to love that we can hope to be better. But I find more strength in purpose, and I find more strength in people who can take all of that and take all those different forces around us and find bravery to keep going and find bravery to take a step forward and to do whatever it is that they're blessed with doing, you know. I mean, that sits within their ability, and sharing that, right? Like, whether that's, it doesn't necessarily mean like speaking out, like everyone has to be a voice, everyone has to have 7 million TikTok followers or whatever the hell it is. I don't think that's the case. I mean, I think it's more like, what's the thing that, or things that actualize you as a person, that make you feel real fulfillment, you know, not a title or some human created thing, but instead something much deeper than that. You know, how do you find your way to that? And I think I don't know, at least my own journey has been a lot of different ways. It's been a lot of failure and a lot of moments where I was like, what the heck am I doing? How did I get here? But then just keep, you know, that momentum forward, you know, even when you fall, even when you don't know what to do next. Something always presents itself. That's life, you know, and learning how to be aware enough to see it when it does present itself, to have the bravery, or at least maybe, I don't know, the obliviousness to be like, all right, let's check it out, you know, let's see where it goes. Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for purpose and for balance and for trying to live different values than the ones that are currently pushed upon us, largely by oligarchy and the never-ending consumption of everything around us, not just goods, not just quote unquote resources, not just labor, but consumption of images, consumption of personality, consumption of almost every aspect of our sensory experience has been moved into consumption. Trying to find a way out of that and into a way of balance is a lifelong journey for sure, and it's a purposeful one. It has all kinds of names too that are, I think, also commercialized. You know, decolonizing and I don't know. That's probably one of the biggest ones right now is decolonizing, but there's a lot of things going on. I mean, I've seen a lot of terms that get thrown around a lot, like mutual aid and grassroots and front lines and all of it. But at the end of the day, to me, a lot of it has really been about actions. And whatever you call it, the actions are there and present, and they speak for themselves, just like they do in nature. I wanted to, let's see, where are we at? We're at 5:47. I can give a little bit more, but I do want folks to know that it's really an honor to me to hear from all of you on where you're at and what you're thinking. Those are the parts I actually usually enjoy the most, is hearing maybe what you came in with, or if something sparked during the conversation, or if it's not even a conversation, this is just one-sided at this point, but you know, I want to hear where you guys are at and what's going on. So please, if you haven't thought of a comment yet or a question, It's my call to you to do so. I'll try to think of a few more things to say, and then I'll just stare at the screen awkwardly until something happens. Let's see. I think this International Women's Day was definitely a moment. We just got out of this huge pipeline fight, and so many of us are facing charges in the legal systems for standing up for drinking water and standing up for my people's homelands. Some of us are facing felonies, years in jail. Others are just, I mean, I've got charges in many different courts at this point for committing trespass on my own land. And so I was thinking about how over this last year, the folks I saw really holding so much space were women, femmes, two-spirit, and non-gendered folks. I feel like it's almost like the people who have been so disenfranchised or silenced are finding each other and standing up for what's right. And that's been reflected across movements, not just this one. I saw the same thing down in the streets of Minneapolis when we were standing together in solidarity with Black lives. It's really beautiful to see that and to witness that from the younger generation, especially. So I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about how, I've got this life that's growing inside of my own body, that I'm about to be a mom, and that's wild. I don't even know what to think of that. It's it's an interesting time for sure. But yeah, I mean, every single person walking the earth came from a womb. So those are beautiful moments, and it's I really appreciate the time in this space from y'all to share some thoughts during a time that is meant to celebrate women, but really came from working class women, right? Like, that's part of the history lesson, is that in our commercialization of some of these pieces, that we think about where it actually really came from, and how it started and how it began, and whose liberation we're talking about, that we do our best to not silence voices in the quest for feminism, in the quest for celebration of women, that we're not asking those questions of, well, which women? It's all women. So yeah, I'll leave it with that. And please ask questions. Thank you again. Spend some Zoom time with me.
Thank you so much, Tara. Tara, your pace and the way that you grounded us in this space today, just thinking about who was with us today, as well as what they've all experienced, and weaving that into your personal experience of the COVID and carrying life. It's just an important model of knowledge sharing. We do have a few questions here. People are putting questions into the chat as opposed to the Q&A box. Okay, now we're getting more in the Q&A box, so that's great. I'm going to ask whether Halo Fresca would be willing to unmute and ask their question.
Hello, good evening. Thank you for this opportunity. Tara Chimiwich, thank you so much for your teachings today. I am part of the migrant settler community known as the Italian Canadian community, with many nuances in our communities and languages as well. And I was wondering what you think about nation-to-nation work in this day and age with Indigenous nations, migrant nations, settler nations, and Indigenous nations based on treaties such as the Gaswenta or Tuvero. Is there value in this today? Do you see this as being without or outside of the systems of colonial nations like the so-called US and Canada? Do you think there is power, legal power in these types of relationships and this kind of work? Just your thoughts on this type of work. Thank you so much again.
For sure, and thanks for the question. I mean, I think, you know, there's the relationships, like you said, like the nation states of like with the United States and with Canada and with other settler colonial nations, right? Like that's a reality that for so many of us that are in relationship, you know, whether that was forced or not, that are based in treaties, that are based in the contractual obligations agreed to between those nations, and regularly violated by one of those parties. As far as the nation to nation, like, you know, with like the settler or immigrant folks and those nations of people, or like those, I guess, communities of people, I mean, I think there is, you know, I've seen some really interesting like grassroots style, like community building and community agreements between my own experiences between Black and Indigenous folks. So reimagining kind of like what communities could look like, living together and living in a way that respects autonomy and sovereignty, but is also one that recognizes the intertwined nature of our liberatory efforts. So I think there is, you know, it's not like, I think there's a way to look at power, right? Which is like, there's colonial power, right? And I think that there's a lot of pieces to colonial power. So there's like the narratives of money, of access, of influence, of, you know, so-called fame, of all these different aspects of what that narrative deems valuable. But then there's also deep value in communities finding power with each other, you know, and communities finding ways to strengthen our efforts by breaking down, you know, as they say in nonprofit speak, it's breaking down silos, right? But they rarely actually break down silos. I mean, at least that's been my experience. But actually doing that in a different kind of way. I mean, I think, you know, whether it's a treaty document or like a written document, or maybe some kind of like, you know, set of principles, community principles or guidelines or whatever. I mean, I think there is power in us thinking that way, because a lot of this has to do with our own understanding and how we move forward, right? If we continue to, like I said, if we keep sticking to the same advocacy streams, we keep sticking to the same exact methods again and again and again, we're going to get the same results over and over and over, rather than beginning to imagine these different types of engagement. So I certainly think there's value in that form of thinking about how we build together, for sure.
Great. If we could hear from Felicia, if you wouldn't mind asking your question, Natalia will unmute you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. I just wanted to thank you for speaking with us today. And I was wondering, how do you feel as an Indigenous lawyer working for or under the justice system while also being, you know, at the hands of it, being an Indigenous woman?
You mean those dirty looks that I get from judges when I'm like sitting in front of them and they're like, Miss Houska again, really? Like, really, this is happening? I mean, I guess, you know, I haven't been kicked out of the bar yet. I don't know if that's going to happen. I hope not, because it is very useful. at times, to be able to help my people with those ways and help the land and other important issues, with that training and that piece of paper that gives you access to certain spaces and places. I mean, it can be a little odd at times, but I mean, I think for me, at least, when I'm standing up for what I know to be true, which is, that I am not trespassing in my own territory, that it is a crime against humanity to knowingly and willfully destroy or put at risk the drinking water of millions of people when we have such a finite amount that we even have access to begin with, and there are already people without access to water. That is wrong. And to even compare that to a person willing to put their bodies in between a machine that's hell-bent on destroying it is, I don't think that water protectors or land defenders are criminals. I think that they are doing work that I hope more humans feel called to do. I think there's like this misperception of like these violent, rowdy, rad people out on front lines, when what I tend to see is actually a lot of love and care and a moment where you are literally standing in between violence being committed on a relative and trying to stop that crime from happening. That's what I see. So it can be a little trying to bring my personal values and my own perspective of life into a courtroom, into a colonial courtroom, can be strange, but so far I guess I've flown through the radar, but I know it's definitely one that's not without risk, for sure.
Thank you, Tara. We do have another question from Tarek. Tarek, we can unmute you now. Ask your question.
Hi, Tara. Bonjour. Jayan, how are you?
Oh, good. How are you?
I'm good. So I just wanted to ask you a question about basically, this is a really important thing on my mind, and also that because I just want to know that as you personally, as an Indigenous First Nations woman and the Indigenous First Nations people of Turtle Island, Canada, generally, do you guys as a people and as you personally generally feel shared solidarity and bonds with other Indigenous peoples around the world, for example, in South Africa and Australia and Palestine and elsewhere?
Absolutely. Some of the moments that have been, I don't know, I mean, it's like indescribable to be in spaces with Indigenous peoples from around the globe. I actually personally tend to not find a ton of value in a lot of the international forums because I feel like those forums lack teeth, they lack efficacy, they lack motion that actually does anything in real time for people suffering around the world, for lands being destroyed. But the one thing that some of those spaces do tend to offer is the opportunity to be together as Indigenous people of the entire globe, to share our stories together, to find our agency, to recognize each other's agency, and to build relationships. And I think it's more than just feeling that connectivity. It's about hearing from each other about, what are you guys experiencing in your own communities. It's oftentimes very, very similar, like different languages, different maybe fact patterns, but at the end of it, it kind of also is so familiar, right? Which really hurts, but it's the truth, which is our people are on something that someone else wanted. And so we're being moved away from it. Something actually to look up, I hope I didn't touch on it in the lecture, is this 30 by 30 initiative that's being sold as this moment of the world's leaders coming together and saving 30% of the earth. And I take Native people are just 5% of the population globally, holding 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. This is going to be an attempt by many, many governments around the globe to grab what remains of those places. Over half of what they propose is indigenous lands. So it's under the guise of, conservation, but it's something that's much more insidious than that, I think. Because what happens when you have land that's in government hands? Then all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, we're going to actually do some explorative drilling. We're going to do some like test frack wells. We're going to start looking at drilling the western half of the Grand Canyon, there's a reason why those places are so beautiful. It's because they're in stewardship in the hands of Native people. So I think those solidarity moments together are incredibly valuable and incredibly important. Not only to not feel alone, but also how do we build together? How do we leverage, maybe our different voices and our different access to different governments, different agencies, different powers, to protect what remains.
Chi Miigwech, that was so heartwarming to hear. I thank you so much, Chi Miigwech.
Miigwech Kagin.
Thank you. If we could have Michelle ask her question next, please.
Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Tara, I'm wondering if you can expand on the news of the Mille Treaty case and if and how that can help more legal climate cases.
You're talking about the Mille band?
Yes. The treaty, I saw it in the news today.
Oh.
That they won.
I mean, I know that there's like a Supreme Court case. I mean, maybe it's the reaffirmation of that case. It's like kind of like this really seminal moment of acknowledging off-reservation ceded rights, so-called ceded rights by the Supreme Court. It was actually a fishing case back in like the 80s and 90s. But I know it's been challenged many, many times since. But it's basically this moment where off-reservation rights have long been a contested issue. So like there's a misunderstanding that just because like it's outside the boundaries of the reservation that Native people don't have any rights to treaty lands. And so some folks wanted to test that and wanted to say, no, that's absolutely not the case. Our treaty territory is our treaty territory, and we have a right to hunt, fish, and gather. And they did. And they went all the way to the Supreme Court and they won. Their rights were affirmed to off-reservation stuff, which is actually a really large factor in a lot of these challenges that you see to like fossil fuel infrastructure or transportation or extraction or refinement. These companies have gotten pretty savvy to the fact that Native people tend to pose a lot of issues to their goals. And so what they've done is they tend to move their pipelines or their whatever, like their exploratory drilling or their frack rigs or whatever, right outside the boundaries of the reservation. But then you see these challenges like well, just because you're outside the boundaries of the reservation, you're still on our treaty territory, and you still harm and impact our rights to hunt, fish, and gather. Our use of fructuary rights is what they're called. So I didn't see the Mille case today, but I'm hoping that it's just if it's positive, it's just a reaffirmment of that,
Yes.
or a reaffirmation of it. Yeah. And that's happened a couple different times in the last few 5-6 years. There's been a number of hunting cases in particular, where people are asserting their rights in national parks, where they're asserting their rights in all kinds of different land status situations, just to say this is our treaty territory and we have a right to it.
Big Witch.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. Tara, I wanted to ask a question quickly. I know in other venues and spaces, you've warned about the dangers of the Energy Security Act in the US, and you've cautioned that we should kind of all be worried about this as a precedent, and about the ways in which the police in Minnesota have been incentivized financially to brutalize Indigenous and protester bodies. I don't want to put words in your mouth, so please forgive me and correct me if I've misquoted some of your arguments, but I wonder if you could say a little bit more about those relationships.
For sure. Yeah, police brutality and the very deep collusion between the state and private interests is becoming really apparent. I mean, I think it's always something that people are aware of, or there's the shadowy them, but then now we're at a place where it's very overt. So here in Minnesota, they actually created something called the Public Safety Escrow Trust, where we're currently at $7.2 million that Enbridge paid police officers and private security, and actually Minnesota's Department of Natural Resources, to essentially become their army and protect the pipeline from the citizens of this place. So yeah, they seem to, the narrative they spin is that it's about safety and it's about making sure that constitutional rights are observed, but that, their investments are protected and kept safe in the public's interest. When in fact, the public is the one that's out in the streets, right? The public is the one that's out in the woods and saying, to the tune of tens of thousands of people, we don't want this, right? That was the public's interest in the regulatory review process, when you got 70,000 people saying no, and yet it goes through anyway. So yeah, the collusion between the police and private interests is really becoming so clear at this point. And the Energy Security Act is just another aspect of that, where you see this kind of banal, seemingly neutral language that in fact gives federal dollars to states to begin to develop energy security plans. There's been these efforts by ALEC and other groups, special interest groups around the country. And they're not just present in the United States, they're present all over the place, lobbying legislatures to begin passing anti-protest laws, to begin passing or strengthening existing critical infrastructure laws to make it a felony. I mean, we've got right now in these cases I've touched on briefly, some folks are being charged with felony assisted suicide for risking their bodies to try to protect the drinking water of millions of people, and they're being charged with assisted suicide. Some of folks are facing felony theft, as if chaining yourself to a machine and being cut off that machine is stealing it, even though you're obviously not carrying the machine away, right? You're literally stopping it from moving in that moment, in that time. The definition of theft isn't anywhere near, but attempts to silence. Here in Minnesota, we actually even saw some of the prosecutors trying to bill to that fund. I guess that was their line. Minnesota turned down those requests for billing. But so far, I think that's actually the only requests I'm aware of that they have turned down to an entity. I mean, I think there might have been some like requests for ammunition or something, or they were trying to say that bulletproof vests were PPE or something like that. I think they got turned down for that one too. It was too far. But yeah. And then in other places around the world, I mean, it's just open, right? Like it's, yeah. So it's getting worse.
I want to thank you for kind of giving us grounded examples of what we think of what we might be talking about as that structural gaslighting. So the idea of committing trespass on your own land or being charged with theft by actors who are thieving the land, and then also being charged with assisted suicide while also being shot with rubber bullets and put in solitary with no medical help. So it's okay for the state to injure your bodies, but not to have the agency to want to put your body in the way of this violence. Mackenzie actually has a question. So Mackenzie, if you'd like to unmute, or Natalia. Unmute.
Yes, I want to ask, how do you endure hypocrisy while working with and like against governments? And how do you, in doing that, maintain like, you know, your own personal strength and hope, especially through like resistance and, you know, the relations that you carry?
How do you engage with the oppressor without losing your head and listening to some of the language that they say when they talk about, well, yeah, I mean, I guess we're building the largest tar sands infrastructure project in North America, but we got this awesome electric vehicle initiative. So, I mean, we're basically doing everything we can, you know, like that's the lingo coming out of places like that. And it can be really, I mean, it can be super draining. You know, it's like you take a little tiny step forward and then oftentimes there's so many steps back, right? Like, okay, so in this particular government, you've got a Trump that comes in and people are like, okay, we have to get this person out of here. He's like a nightmare on every single front. And then Biden is put into place, and he's tries to center himself through narrative push as being the climate president, but then is responsible for more oil and gas leases than Trump, you know, like in like his first little foray into office, he's been improving gas leases and oil leases left and right. I mean, that's supposed to be celebrated as a win, right? Like according to so many of the NGOs, like this is at least Biden's movable. And it's like, okay, well, what did we trade off, you know? And I tend to fall into the category of, I don't know, I don't think that electoral politics are a solution making path that should have nearly as much energy poured into it as it currently does. I think an enormous amount of energy is expended on electoral politics and constantly looking up instead of looking around at locality-based efforts. I think as far as maintaining myself in those spaces, it can be really, really hard. I worked out in DC for a number of years and saw people regularly grappling with that, including myself. And it's a way to, you're putting yourself into like kind of like the place that you're trying to push against and create change in. And in doing so, it can be really easy to lose yourself and to lose hope, to begin to think this is the way things are. I don't know. I mean, for me personally, like those moments or like those times when it got to be too much, I really put a lot of value in spending time with land, spending time with water. And even in an urban setting, that is totally possible. And I think we're somehow believe that like nature is like somewhere else. It's like this like untouched conservationist dream, but it's actually around us all the time, even when it's concrete, even when it's been manipulated into different elements or manipulated in different presentations. It's still here. It's in us, right? Like we're nature ourselves. And so trying to maintain that integrity and that knowledge and that truth can be a way to survive those places and to maintain focus and to not succumb to a extractive way of looking at the world, an individualistic way of looking at the world, that it's dog eat dog and that we can't possibly be in community when that's not true. It's tough. It's really tough, and you got to do a lot of work. You got to do a lot of personal work in self-reflection and like all of that, to hold on to the truth that you know inside yourself. So yeah, if anyone is looking at engaging in those systems, armor yourself up with all kinds of different pieces. I armor myself up with my values, with my love, with my community, with the forest. You know, that's what I'm thinking about. That's who I'm thinking about. And then spending time with the littles, you know, those guys, very clear for them. There's no doubt.
It's very inspiring, Tara. Thank you. We also have a question from Sophia. If we can get Sophia unmuted, please, Natalia.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking today. It's very inspiring. My question might pertain if you don't know what it is. It might not pertain if you don't know what it is, but I was wondering if you have heard about the old growth forest protests in BC pertaining to the Fairy Creek protests, and if so, what are your thoughts and personal opinions on it?
I have indeed. I have not followed that as closely as some others. I would say I know that those protests are not just this generation, they've actually been around 4 generations, protecting old growth forests in BC. I know that it's like so many other struggles, it doesn't just end with one iteration. It tends to keep coming back, like these pipelines keep coming back, the fracked gas keeps coming back, the attacks on the forest keep coming back as people, you know, or as corporations, which are made of people, but corporations seek more and more and more of the ecosystem to consume. I think, you know, some of the pieces I've seen in a Fairy Creek have been really creative, have been really incredibly brave. I think there seem to be some lessons between allies and Indigenous people, and kind of like the intersections of those relationships, and trying to figure out how do we stand together in a good way. How do we come together and respect each other in a good way and mutually serve the goal of protecting this beautiful place, of protecting this life that's been around for much longer than any of us. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, any time that people are willing to give voice to the voiceless, you know, and it's not even the voiceless, it's just like the lack of human understanding, right? I think that's a really powerful act. And I certainly think there are ways to do things that are much more steeped in values and in recognizing the inequity that does exist between us as human beings. But I do think it's really powerful when folks stand up for something more than themselves. So, you know, anytime folks are out resisting. It's really incredible.
Okay, we're coming close to our time, so I'm wondering if maybe Ali and Jasmine can both say their questions, and then Tara can respond to both or one or parts of both or parts of one. So Ellie and Jasmine.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank you so much. This is so techy. Thank you so much for speaking to us today, and congratulations on being a mom soon. I was wondering sort of how, whether you think that sometimes in a world where we're constantly consuming media and everything else that you've mentioned, is it justified to be ignorant to that sometimes? Or like in my personal experience, when I do, decide to tune out, then I feel guilty for doing so. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts specifically about like climate depression and looking into the future. So thank you so much.
Hi, I hope you guys can hear me. My question was, how like as a lawyer you can practice law and you're actually doing something. So for us as students, like we have the education, we know, like we have the privilege to actually differentiate between what's right and what's wrong. So what can we do about it then? Like knowing something is different than actually doing something about it. So like, how do we get started? What do we do? Thank you.
For sure. Thank you both for your questions. Well, I think for the how to get started, that's a little bit simpler. I think maybe, I don't know. Like, how to get started can be a lot of things, right? Oh, I love the dog start. I think there's all kinds of ways to get involved. I think a really important thing is definitely figuring out like what you want to contribute, and also doing the kind of like the work to figure out who's already doing this, who's out there and doing the work. How do I plug in or support or help that work? How do I begin to contribute in some way that's helpful? And then if maybe you are in the unique situation where there's nothing going on and there's some unknown issue there, like something's happening that no one knows about yet, I can guarantee there are groups that are around that maybe have some insight into like where a good starting point might be, whether that's like, you're in the regulatory review process, you might intervene in that process and submit comments, you might, do petitions, which petitions are petitions. Please don't end your work with that. Or, you're beginning to build a community base of people that are engaged in the issue. That is a really, really critical piece, and it's actually really difficult work to do, community building. I think that's where we kind of tend to, when we see this kind of one size fits all, and this like really capital driven style of organizing, which is like building a newsletter base to get people to send in money versus locality based organizing, which is like, this is the issue of our community. How do we get people involved from the community? I think that's a really good place to start. And then to your question about like feeling guilty, I'll say that in the last 7.5 months of growing a tiny human, I have personally I'm still pretty engaged, but I'm less engaged than I have been in a long time. I've been focused on both grieving the loss of the Line 3 fight. The pipeline was built, and that was just so many years of struggle and lots of outcomes that are beautiful also, like building a large community and reaching so many hearts and minds that then reach other hearts and minds. But yeah, it's so hard to keep up with it all. And sometimes you really do, like, for your own sanity, have to take time for yourself. I don't think that there should be guilt involved in that. Like, we need to be well to function in the world, and in a way that's not toxic, in a way that is able to keep opening ourselves to empathy and to seeing each other as the beautiful spirits that we are, the potentials that we are. And if we continually inundate ourselves, I mean, I think that that's actually can be quite harmful. So long story short, I would say don't feel guilty about taking moments to care for yourself, and self-care is a word that is really, really, I think, been co-opted into all kinds of things, but like something like that is needed, to be able to keep healing, because we are hurting from some of this that we see. It hurts us to see these images. It hurts us to read these stories. It hurts to hear those cries for help and to understand that we live in a world that is so jaded that some cries are valued more than others. I mean, it's hard, and the more we engage outward, I think the more it's important to care for ourselves so we can keep doing that without becoming really hurt and becoming also jaded to it. So, yeah. Appreciate you both.
Thank you, Tara. Unfortunately, for the sake of time, and I'm sure you're exhausted, we will have to conclude the Q&A. For the 160 intro students, we can take up some of these questions next week in class as well and carry on the conversation. I know that Tara has a lot of interviews online if folks would like to learn more about the Giniw Collective. And Tara, your talk and the contemplativeness just kind of interrupts what you called the constant scrolling of trauma. Even if only for tonight, you've helped us take a minute to absorb and reflect on the moment that we're living in. And I do feel like when you talk, I feel the impulse not to sort of produce and run, but there's a kind of a pause. And I think that the call to kind of tap into our inner truths and authenticities and our integrity, you've helped us make some room for that tonight, to tap into our gut, our own sense of integrity and truths. And I know I'll be taking away your call for thinking about our purpose rather than hope, I suppose, or like a kind of prioritization of finding your purpose. I want to thank everyone today who's attended and contributed questions, as well as I want to thank Mackenzie, Serene, Elisa, and Joe for helping to organize this event. And a special thank you to June Larkin, who's been organizing these events for the past years. It's great to have you with us today. Thank you, Tara, again, for helping us to think about purpose, bravery, balance, and interrogating value systems in relation to fulfilling ourselves and not fulfilling what you called human-made titles. And I will keep thinking about that. In essence, also for helping us think about breaking colonial binaries of value and helping us to continue to validate our counter narratives in an effort to decolonize our discursive and material spaces. I'm sending so much strength to you and your little one, who is so lucky to have such a sort of fierce parent to come into the world with. So take care, everyone. There are a couple of students that are asking if there's a way to be in touch with you after the talk, and I'm thinking to refer them to maybe your Instagram account. What do you think, Tara?
Go for it. Yeah.
Okay.
Hit me up on Instagram. If I don't reply, just hit me up again or something. I try to stay. I'm not super good at socials. You'd think I'd be a lot better. I know I have those check marks or whatever the hell they are, but I'm actually not very good at social media. So yeah, but I appreciate the effort and the thought for sure. And good luck with everyone in your studies. You guys are gonna rock it out. rock it so hard. You've got a great professor. I'm sure all of you have awesome professors, but I really appreciate it, Wafa.
Thank you, Tara. That's so kind. Thank you. Okay, take care, everyone. Good night, and take some time to absorb all of this goodness and live in this moment and allow yourself to absorb everything that we've kind of talked about tonight. And thanks again for your attention, and talk soon. Good night, everyone.
Igwabman.